Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Jack the Lad podcast. On today's episode, we've got on Martin Gregus, and just pass it over to you, Martin. Martin, yes, sorry.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm a wildlife photographer, drone pilot, cinematographer. Been doing this for a very long time, so glad to be here and share my story.
Yeah, brilliant. Before we came on the podcast, obviously, I said thank you very much for coming on and sharing your story with us. And yeah, again, yeah, thank you very much. So, when you're from take us back to the start. When did you first sort of fall in love with photography?
Yeah, I mean, photography for me started almost 2 decades ago. I was 8 years old when I picked up my first camera and with my dad. And in Slovakia, he had a 9 to 5, and I wasn't really that interested. I didn't really have time to not time. I didn't really have time to be with him. And then when we moved to Canada, I would go around with him all the time, see him take pictures, and ultimately I decided that's kind of what I want to do too. I don't want to just stand there. I also want to be creative and see the world through his eyes. So I got my first camera and started taking pictures in the cities of people, boats, airplanes, things like that. Every weekend we were out somewhere taking pictures, and then ultimately that sort of translated to nature and wildlife. I mean, you're in Canada, there's animals literally everywhere, so it was only natural that it kind of floated that way eventually.
Yeah, definitely. When you were first in the city, taking your photos and whatnot, what sort of photos would you take?
Yeah, these were, I mean, I love taking pictures of people, but I love taking pictures of people without them necessarily knowing it. Because I feel like as soon as I pointed the camera at them and told them I'm taking their picture, they would act completely unnatural. And that sort of took away from that city life. And then so we would just take pictures on the streets, through from the car, things like that. And I loved it. I still do. Like to this day, whenever I'm traveling, I do a lot of people photography just because you get that interesting thing where it happens where you take a picture and you see a sign in the background, and all of a sudden it kind of like transpires to that person, and things just start to make sense and weird coincidences. And it's strange how many weird coincidences you have of just signs and graphics and things like that. And my dad's a graphic designer, so he loves it even more than I do. Like again, whenever we travel, it is kind of the first thing we do, because nature you need time for. You need to sit down, you need to uh, give that animal space and time and get them used to you and all of this stuff. With people, I can just go on the street and I can just start clicking away and come back with a lot of great content relatively quickly. So when I travel, that's sort of still what I lean towards, unless I have 2 or 3 months to dedicate to one species.
So you spoke then obviously about your photos and stuff like that while in the city. When you were 8 and when you first began your journey, what sort of equipment are you rocking?
I mean, I was just using a little tiny point and shoot at first that I got for Christmas. I saved up all year for it, and my parents ended up helping me buy it. And I think to this day, that's probably the best Christmas present I ever got. I was so excited. I'm pretty sure I got it on their tree. I was just crying. I was like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. And then ultimately, when my dad ended up buying new cameras and things like that, which wasn't quite often. We were immigrants. We never really had any money to buy expensive kit or anything like that, or travel, or et cetera, et cetera. So eventually I inherited like his 6 megapixel Nikon D70. It was uh, something I shot with for years. Like even when it broke, we ended up buying another broken one and combining them together to form one working camera. And I had a 70 to 400 millimeter lens, which was bigger than me at that point. And so it was hilarious walking around filming wildlife, and I'm this tall, the lens is this tall. So it was quite funny and theatrical, I would say.
With the internals of a camera and stuff like that, obviously I'm assuming that you can sort of take one apart and fix it, build one from the inside out at this point.
Ish, probably. I can definitely fix. I mean, my dad more so than me. I'm not as technically talented as he is. He can definitely take anything apart and fix it. I'm aspiring to be that, but I'm definitely not. But there's definitely equipment we build ourselves. Like I wouldn't go so far as saying I can take apart an icon and merge it with a different one. There's just so much technicalities there, especially at this point in my career. I don't do that. But there's definitely a lot of camera equipment that we specialize in, that we build, and that we form. Like we last summer we built a camera car, so we customized the Jeep Wrangler to have be fully kitted with all sorts of cameras. I ended up crashing it in September, so it wasn't long lived. But now we're building another one. So
How did you crash it?
oh, it was just the car crashed itself ultimately. Like we were heading back from a trip, and I was just literally on vacation basically, and heading home, and my front axle, literally one of the arms holding it, dropped to the ground and dug itself into the ground and flipped the whole car over. And yeah, that was just physically I was fine. I was going about 10 kilometers an hour, thank goodness. But emotionally it's been absolutely draining to have to deal with it, and the insurance. And even right now as we're on this call, I've for the last 2 months I've just been on the phone back and forth with insurance because they're refusing to pay me, and there's just so many logistics around it, and I can't afford to buy a new car until they do. And yeah, it's just been absolutely exhausting. So even while we're here, I'm waiting for a text message to figure out what's happening today with that. So
All right. Well, I hope it all goes well for you and you get it all sorted.
yeah, fingers crossed. Well, yeah, it's one of the. I'm not a very multitask person. I've never been. So for me, until that's settled, I can't fully 100% commit to anything else in my life. So again, like, even replying to Instagram messages, I'm like, I need to be in a very specific mood to be able to do that. So
Yeah, well, I don't have that problem at the minute. I don't have a ridiculous following. We were talking about it before, like the like social media aspect of like all of this. I am terrible at it. Like I honestly, I go on, I'll just find people like yourself, and then message, and then wait for the reply. Really, I put out stuff, but I mean, nothing like the stuff obviously that you've got on, and the reason I've got you on. So the reason, obviously, that I got you on and what I came across, which for obviously the picture, the videos are amazing, but also I've shown a lot of people it, and I put it on my story and stuff like that, and it was just quite I don't know what's the word. It was just I didn't realize. I suppose it's sort of stupidly. I've never given it much thought. But with the polar bears, obviously in the the radiant colours and stuff, and the all the vibrant colours and that they were in and around, it just seems so odd to see a polar bear in that habitat, I suppose.
and that's everyone's like, and again, that's one of the reasons why these pictures I think have gotten so much traction, is because they're showing something incredibly unique, in the sense that we haven't seen it. It's not necessarily unique in the sense that it's not happening. Obviously these bears have been in this area for hundreds of years, and the Arctic, I don't think people realize that in the summer it is ice free, a lot of it, and on the land there isn't much snow. Especially in the Arctic that we go to. It's around the Hudson Bay. It is the well below the Arctic Circle. It's probably slightly above Stockholm, in terms of latitudes and long. So it's, from that sense, it's not high up. And the Arctic, in that area, you still have trees, but you don't have many of them. It's not the high Arctic where you're not really gonna get much vegetation. I've been up there. It is an incredibly barren landscape. You get plants, but they're only about this far off the ground. And parts of that Arctic do stay locked in ice and snow for a large part of the year, not so much anymore, but definitely used to. But in this area, you know, you do get the flowers, you get the trees, you get the greenery. It is a landscape that is incredibly magical. And the way the bears are integrated into that environment is absolutely fascinating. And no one has really documented it, even though it does happen every single year. The only reason we haven't seen it was because there was no person there to document it. And in 2015, that was the idea of the project. It was let's go to this area when everyone else has left, and let's film the bears and flowers, and let's see where it goes. I didn't think it was going to go this far. I absolutely did not. It would have been a dream for me to think that, but it has.
Yeah. So just looking at it from, you know, a normal person, I suppose someone that's outside of that thing. What have you learned from polar bears that you didn't sort of necessarily think they would do, or, you know, characteristics or anything like that?
I mean, we learned so much, right? Like you live with them. You know, I know a lot of the polar bears. I say I know them a lot better than some of my friends, because I spend every hour of every single day with them. Sometimes a singular bear, sometimes more than one, and you really get to know them, and you really realize that every bear, every animal in general has its own characteristic, has its own character, has its own way of going through life and things like that. We as people, we've gotten so disconnected from the environment that we don't understand it, because when we look at an animal in its environment, we see it for a very short period of time and we say, oh, you know, that's a deer or that's a bear, and we don't understand their place in that environment. But living with them, you realize, listen, like that one specializes in hunting terns. That one is a very different mother than that one. That's a male that's a lot more aggressive than that male. And you realize that every one of them has a different place. And you take one of them out of that environment, you potentially got rid of a generation of that characteristic. And yeah, it's something that really touched on us while we got to know them, and something that was really unexpected, I think, because again, you grow up thinking these are predators and they're solitary and um, all of these things, and then you go out there and you see 10 of them together, and then you see them evolving to this quickly changing landscape, and it's fascinating.
My thing that when what you're talking about then, what sort of a distance are you keeping between yourself and the polar bears?
I mean, I've had them knock on my window a few times, in which case I could put a hand out and his face was on the other side of the glass. I
What sort of glass are we
oh,
talking?
I mean, a regular window glass. If he
Just,
really tried, he could go through it, but he's not, like, they're not going to. They're not that aggressive. I mean, they are aggressive if you force them, but they're not. Um, at no point in time was I considering he's going to go through the glass and hurt me. By that point, you've done something wrong, because it's going to take him a while to get through. And by that point, you can get out your bear spray, you can get out your rocks, you can get out your air horns, you can do so much um, to mitigate that from ever happening. But when we walk around them, I've been as close as 10, 15 meters to some polar bears, where you don't really have a protection of camp between you and them. But it's mostly bears I know, it's bears I've spent time with, that I do feel safe enough to do that with them.
you mentioned there about bear spray and rocks and stuff. Do you not take a rifle or anything like that with you?
I do have a rifle with me. It's my bear guard's holding it. It's not me that has the rifle. Um, but the last thing you're gonna do is use it. It's literally the last ditch effort of using that rifle against the polar bear. But you have no intention of using it. You just walk out with it, because the bear has teeth and claws and you have nothing. So you want to be equally matched if something does happen. But the rifle doesn't even work in terms of against the polar bear, because the sound the rifle makes is very equivalent to ice banging together in the winter time. So you fire it, the bear's not really going to notice. Rocks, on the other hand, and things like that, we found that they freak the bears right out, and you're able to defend yourself without having any consequence towards that animal.
Have you had any encounters like that?
Not really. I mean, there's times when we've had bears come to camp, and you just I throw a rock on the ground, never at the bear, but you throw it near the bear, and it tells him, listen, I'm not crossing this line. But never have I really felt in danger from these animals. And I've spent time around over 100 different polar bears at this point. Never have they do test you a little bit, but never do they full on charge you. Or, I mean, that's not to say they won't if, a normal person does this. But to us, they have never done that. The Arctic environment is a lot more challenging in that sense. And that is where we get most of our issues, and most of the times I've felt in danger from anything.
You mentioned there as well, but sort of moved on a bit. Did you say a bear guard? I'm assuming that's someone there to watch your six, basically, whilst you're.
Yeah, so I have a whole team with me. It's myself, usually an assistant who comes along to help with camp, help film, not necessarily take pictures, but definitely to film our experience. Usually friends of mine that I've known for a while that I take up, because I never travel alone anywhere. Just rule number one for my sake. And then a bear guard who comes out and makes sure that when we're busy filming animals, he's watching it on all the other animals, because the polar bear you're worried about is not the one you're filming. It's the one that's going to come from behind and surprise you. So that's why you need the bear guard and someone to watch over your back.
Yeah, definitely. Have you noticed? Obviously, there's big thing in the media and stuff all the time about global warming. Have you seen obviously the retraction of the ice? Each do you know what I mean? Each time you go, is it sort of getting that much further back?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see it firsthand. I've worked in Antarctica before. You see it there. You see it in the Arctic. Where we go, you don't see it as much as I've seen it in the high Arctic, where the evidence of that is extreme. But where we are, you see more the unpredictability of the ice, and that's why I've kind of a reason I've also chosen to film bears in the summer. It's because it is a little bit more predictable, because when that summer is going to be. In the winter time, we've stopped to understand when the ice is going to form, because it used to be like, this is the day, and the ice varied by a few days of that date of when it actually forms and when it melts. In recent years, it's come to a point where that variation is up to a month off, which has huge impacts on the bears, because they're getting ready to hunt seals, and they're getting ready to go on the ice, and they still haven't. Some years I've seen the ice form in in early November, and some years it doesn't form until early December to mid-December. I've seen it melt at the start of July. I've seen it melt at the end of July. So there's huge variations in the Arctic now, as everywhere else. And also the extremes of the weather that is there. In 2020, I was there. We were filming flowers. We never got flowers because they never bloomed. And there was still ice on the ocean. Everything was calmer. There wasn't many thunderstorms. And then last year we went and we had thunderstorms a few times a week. We had extreme winds, extreme conditions. The flowers did bloom, but everything was a little bit more extreme. We had smoke from the fires burning down south. It really reminded you of how small the world is, and how the things we do, say, in our cities, in Vancouver and the UK, and how much implication they have on the planet as a whole.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We've just had, obviously, I don't know whether I don't know whether it made international news or anything. We had the Stop Oil protesters all around all the major motorways around the UK. bringing pretty much everything to a stop. Obviously, with that. So when you're out there, you say obviously you go for. Is it how long do you go out there for?
I mean, the expeditions usually are with the actual prep of being, say, we go out of Churchill with the prep of actually being in Churchill and all of that, and then the takedown of the expedition later. Usually about a month. But I actually living with the polar bears, I spent 13 days with them in 2020, 20 days with them in 2021. And that's pure camping with the bears, far away from anybody or anything.
And how does it all get set up? How do you come to the thing where, right, we're going on this day, you and you are coming, we're going to be out for this long, all the rest of it. How do you come up with the sort of plan and schedule?
Yeah, so the expeditions are around the end of, July, August when we go out. Planning for that starts in about January, February, where I work with the company I work for up in Churchill, and we start communicating of what's going to happen, when are we leaving, what kit are we bringing up, who's bringing what, and that is like a 4 month process. And then in June we start to settle like flights and transportation and things like that, and you really start to pack, because I found if I don't start packing a few months now in advance, I'm going to forget something. So in our photography studio right beside me here, I start laying everything on the ground. And by the end of that month, the entire floor here is absolutely covered. You have nowhere to step because you have sleeping bags, you have food, you have camera gear, drones, underwater equipment, tripods, remote controls, everything here. And then you load it up into a car like we did in 21, and we drove it up to Churchill, and then you have to set up camp and fix everything from the year before, set everything up, set the date. You kind of just sit around and wait for a little bit to figure out the best time when the weather and the stars line up basically, and then you head out.
So on that, you mentioned drones then, and you mentioned obviously in the intro that you fly the drones. How long have you been using drones, and what sort of an advantage has that given you?
Yeah, I mean, we've been using drones since they first came out. I think my first one was the Phantom 2. I think 2012 I got it. I would have to triple check when I actually got it. It's been a while. And that drone, it was one of the first ones. It had nowhere near the quality it has now. But it revolutionized the industry, and it revolutionized my work, because my photography was always based around looking for different angles, looking for different times of year to photograph ordinary situations and get a different angle on life in general. And with the drones, all of a sudden it was like, hey, here's this tool. It's this big. You can put it in your pack and you can be a helicopter. And so we ended up using that extensively on so many things, and then using it in such a way that because people used it as a replacement for helicopters, high up establishers, things like that. And then all of a sudden we took this drone and we started flying it inside buildings and through trees and forests and things like that to really get a different angle on life. I mean, now you have an FPV and you can do that relatively easily. I mean, we were still doing it with Inspires and Phantoms a few years ago. So it's really revolutionized the industry and the way I even look at life.
So with your use of your drones, what sort of distances can you go? I know nothing about drones. I've never used one, if I'm honest. But yeah, so what's the sort of range and coverage? And obviously with the cold weather up there, is it that cold? I'm assuming it is still quite cold.
I mean, in the summer, I've had days when it's 30 degrees almost. So
oh, right.
Not as cold as you would expect, for sure.
Oh, okay. I was going to say with that obviously must drain the batteries, but obviously if it's not and it's a sort of normal weather.
I mean, in the wintertime for sure. I mean, I've flown at -30. and then your battery life is half and less than what it usually is, which is around 30 minutes with the new drones. I mean, you can fly them a few kilometers. You're never actually gonna fly them a few kilometers. I mean, people definitely do. You shouldn't, because the transmission, when there's nothing in your way, you can go really far away. But we, with our permits and licenses, we have to fly with line of sight, so as you can fly as far as you can see it. But we use binoculars and things like that sometimes so that we can extend that a little bit, especially when we're flying in remote areas where the nearest community is 3 hours away by boat. So the drone is never going to reach that community. It's never going to reach an airport. It's never going to reach a settlement. If it falls, it's going to fall into the ocean. So you can push that a little bit, but you still have to see it and follow those regulations. And we are a licensed drone school in Vancouver, so I do take a lot of these things slightly more seriously or I like to think I do, just because I couldn't go to my students and tell them something if I'm not also following those rules myself.
Oh yeah, definitely, absolutely. So on with the drones, have you ever sort of flown it up and around, and you've been looking and you found a polar bear or any other animal that you didn't know was there until you had the drone, and then you're, oh bloody hell, there's a polar bear just over there.
Sometimes you do, but it's funny because a lot of people always say, like, let's use the drone as like a recon, and let's find the animal, and then we know where it is, and then we can go film it. Most of the time, finding a little tiny animal like this on a drone on a screen that's this big, it's sometimes damn near impossible. So usually I'll find the animal with my long lens. I'll scout or binoculars, and I'll scout the area. I'll find out where the animal is, and I'll pinpoint it based on geographical features and things like that in my head. And then I'll take off with the drone and I'll fly in that general direction. Everything looks different, obviously, because a little hill, when you take off, all of a sudden you have a hill, and then there's another hill, and then there's another hill.
Yeah.
But you're roughly able to pinpoint the animal, and then you fly to it, and then you know where it is, and then you can film it. Sometimes you're going to find an animal that you weren't expecting, not necessarily on the tundra because everything's flat. You can see really far away. But I have found things like moose and things like in the forest before with the drone, where I was doing scenics, and I found them at a lake or something like that. It's definitely possible. It's not out of the question.
Yeah, being obviously from the UK, we don't have sort of a vast array of animals, especially not sort of predators like that, especially like the polar bears, and obviously the big game animals like moose. I didn't realise how big they were until I think it was on a Instagram or YouTube or whatever. I was watching, and it literally was like walked past a car, and I was like, Jesus Christ, they're fucking massive.
They're ginormous. I didn't see one for a very long time. In Canada, there is a lot of wildlife, but it is incredibly hard to find, and unfortunately, it's not managed very well at all. And it is extremely depleted in the sense that we like to say that there's so much of it here, but in fact, it's been overhunted. The habitat has been destructed to the point where it's unrecognizable in some areas. So when you do find animals, they are hard to find, or you have to go to very specific places that are still wild. I did see, when I saw my first moose, actually, it was in the Yukon, and I was just driving my RV, and I passed by a little lake, and there was a moose in the middle of the lake. I said, "Wow, like this is spectacular. I've never seen a moose before." So I ended up spending about 3 or 4 hours with it, to the point where the moose felt comfortable enough with me that it walked like 20 meters by me when it was the sunset already and it was getting dark, and she was going into the bush to sleep. So she passed right by. It was spectacular.
With that, it just reminded me, actually, I had a question earlier. Have you ever had a situation where you've just been sort of driving along and you've been like, oh, stop, camera out, and you're off to the races, and you've had like a chance encounter?
Absolutely. It happens, I think, more often than not. The polar bear expeditions have been something recently where it's like we know what we want to film, we know the animal species, we know the location, let's go. But before that, a lot of the natural photography I did with my father, or the people I brought on my trips, was we're just driving along and we're going to see what we see, and we're going to get up at sunrise and maximize our opportunity. But for the most part, you're just driving and you're waiting for an animal or for a landscape or for something to happen. And when it does, you're ready for it. And yeah, that's been a huge chunk of my wildlife photography and film career before all of this happened. Because now it's more set, like, okay, I'm filming this animal, I'm going to go to the Amazon and I'm going to film river dolphins and jaguars, or I'm going to go to Antarctica and I'm going to film penguins or polar bears, or it's very specific now. But before that, it was very much like, let's travel and see what we see.
Is there anywhere that you haven't been to that you would like to go to?
I mean, Africa. I've set foot on Africa, but not to the extent that I want to. And it's funny because I talk to cinematographers who mostly work in Africa, and they're like, well, usually people start in Africa because it's such a wild place, and they want to make their way into the Arctic and Antarctic. While I'm working the other end of that um sequence, where I'm like, okay, I started in the Arctic and I want to make my way to Africa and all these other wild places. But we'll see. I do have projects on the go. I did just co-direct a documentary on elephants and their conservation in Africa with a buddy of mine, an amazing cinematographer. Uh, the movie is going to come out shortly here. It is going to be a very beautiful piece, part of a 4-part series on saving African wildlife. So we just did the elephants. Next up is um, wild African wild dogs and other predators and big cats, and it's a beautiful series.
In Africa, what's the animal that you want to photograph?
It would probably be rhinos or elephants. I had a long when I was a kid, and I first like wildlife for me began long before wildlife photography. And when I was a kid there in Slovakia, there was the zoo behind our house, and I knew that zoo so well that I knew all the trainers as the 5 or 6 year old. And I used to go there all the time. And I spent so much time with the rhinoceroses there, and got to know them, and used to go feed them in the zoo with the trainers, and learned about them and pet them, and um, just got to know them, and built that relationship that I'd love to go to Africa and see them in the wild. Because it's one thing seeing them in captivity. For those rhinos, they were a stepping stone in conservation. They were an amazing breeding population and ambassadors for their species in terms of captive bred rhinos. But I'd love to see them in the wild and build those relationships there, like we did with the polar bears.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything else you want to talk about while you're on here?
I don't know if you have any questions. I
On
think
well, in fact, actually, yeah. With the habitat destruction you were saying about in Canada, what is that? What's that equated to?
I mean, I like to say that Canada has amazing PR in terms of how we showcase ourselves to the world. But when you actually come here or even fly over Canada, the amount of deforestation, it just blows my mind. And then, you have the forest fires and you wonder how they happen. It's like, well, okay, everyone knows why they happen. The forest is not able to hold half the moisture it has in the past because half of it isn't even there. And then it burns out, and then it rains, and then obviously it's going to flood. Like we had catastrophic flooding last year, and it was followed through by a summer full of forest fires and things like that. So it's very sad to see, and it really puts it into perspective. Again, being with the polar bears and seeing smoke from fires that are not even anywhere near those polar bears really reminds you how small everything really is. And I think we all really need to step up and conserve our wild places, and at the same time reconnect with the natural world, because again, we've gotten so disconnected from it that I feel like if we found that connection again, and decided to go on hike or spend some time with these animals, they don't have to be polar bears, it can be any animal in general. I feel like we'd be a lot happier as people, and ultimately we would benefit and the natural world would benefit as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think people are far too removed from wildlife and stuff like that. I'm ex-military, so I've camped out under just a thin sheet and or sometimes nothing.
No,
s-
it's exhilarating.
yeah, I love it. It's like going out and about and getting in with nature. Like where I live is quite rural in the UK. I've literally got fields all around me. So when I have the kids and stuff, we're just straight out and out into the woods and whatnot, and walk till the little lad's legs are basically. But yeah, so I'll do a thing as well towards the end of the episode. I'll just get the guests to say a few bits and sort of what they would say to anyone, the younger generation that wants to get into, your sort of field. So yeah, what would you sort of say to a younger person?
I mean, have a dream and never give up on it. I've had this dream of working as a wildlife photographer, of being in Nat Geo, working in natural history, and ever since I was a little kid. And you're gonna face challenges. You're gonna want to quit multiple times. I believe me, I have. But I'm an extremely stubborn person, so whenever someone told me I can't do something, I just tried 10 times as hard to do it. Um, but you're going to face those challenges, and it's going to be hard, especially if you're a young wildlife photographer, or young anything, because as a teenager, that's going to play with your mind. There was a period for a long time I didn't enter competitions or anything like that because I was too scared of what my peers would say about my pictures and that they weren't good enough. But just because someone says something doesn't make it so. There's so many other things that come into play. We're all people. So that would be the main thing is yeah, just don't give up on it and follow through. It's going to be difficult, absolutely, but ultimately the benefits of doing what you love are are amazing. No one's going to live with polar bears for 33 days and eat nothing but Mr. Noodles and sleep uninterrupted sleep and lose 10 pounds by the end of the trip unless you absolutely love your job. And that's exactly what we do, or what I do, is I love it.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant, and the photos just show the sort of attention and care that you take and the time that you take, obviously, to get them, awesome shots. Well, thanks very much for coming on the podcast today, Martin.
Yeah, no worries. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No, definitely, 100%. I'll have you on whenever you like. It was wicked. Do you want to tell everyone your Instagram and socials?
Yeah, you can visit my Instagram, my wild live. Again, I now I've gotten really good at posting, so you're gonna see content from polar bears and the rest of the world almost every single day. On there is my link to my YouTube channel, where we have a documentary film coming out later this year about our experience with the polar bears, 33 days amongst bears, the film. It is an amazing story, and it really is an insight into how we got all those shots. um and those are kind of the two channels I post on, so I hope to see you guys there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Martin, and
Awesome.
we'll see you soon, everybody.
Yeah, see you guys soon.
Cheers. Bye bye.